Chapter 33 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 33. The door of her apartment closed behind Maxine, and she turned, swift as a coursed hare, to the door of Monsieur Cartel. No hesitation touched her. She needed sanctuary. Sanctuary she must have. She opened her neighbour's door, careless of what might lie behind, bringing with her into the quiet rooms a breath of fierce disorder. The living-room, with its piano and its homely chairs and table, was lighted by a common lamp, and the little Jacqueline, the only occupant, sat in the radius of the light, peacefully sewing at a blue muslin gown that was to adorn a Sunday excursion into the country. At the sound of the stormy entry she merely raised her head, but at sight of her visitor she was on her feet in an instant, the heap of muslin flowing in a blue cascade from her lap to the floor. "Madame! Hide me!" cried Maxine. "Madame! Lock the outer door, and if Mr. Brake should knock—" Jacqueline made no further comment. When her visitor's face is blanched, and her limbs tremble as did those of Maxine, the Jacquelines of this world neither question nor hesitate. She went across the room without a word, and the key clicked in the lock. Maxine was standing in the middle of the room when Jacqueline returned. Her body was still quivering, her nostrils fluttering, her fingers twisting and intertwisting in an excess of emotion. And at sight of the familiar little figure, words broke from her with the fierceness of a freed torrent. "Jacqueline, you see before you a mad woman, and one filled with the fear of her madness. They say the insane are mercifully oblivious. It is untrue." She almost cried the last words, and turning began a swift pacing of the room. "Madame," Jacqueline caught her breath at her own daring. "Madame, you know at last, then, that he loves you?" Maxine stopped, and her burning eyes fixed themselves upon the girl. This speech of Jacqueline's was a breach of all their former relations, but her brain had no room for pride. She was grappling with vital facts. "I know at last that he loves me," she repeated confusedly. "That he loves you, madame. That unknowingly he has always loved you. How else could he have treated Monsieur Max so sacredly, almost as he might have treated his own child?" But Maxine was not dealing in psychological subtleties. "Love!" she cried out. "Love! All the world is in a conspiracy over this love." "Because love is the only real thing, madame." "Perhaps, but not a love of which you speak. The love of the soul, but not the love of the body." "Madame, can one truly give the soul and refuse the body? Is not the instinct of love to give all?" The little Jacqueline spoke her truth with a frail confidence very touching to behold. She was a child of the people. Her sole weapons against the world were a certain blonde beauty, a certain engaging youthfulness. But she looked Maxine steadfastly in the eyes, meeting the anger, the scorn, the fear compassed in her glance. "I know the world, madame. It is not a pretty place. When I was 16 years old I left my parents because it called to me, and in the distance its voice was pleasant. I left my home. I had lovers." She shrugged her shoulders in an extreme philosophy. "I tried everything except love. Then I met Lucien." Her philosophy merged curiously to innocence, almost to the soft innocence of a child. "I ran away again, madame. I fled to Lise." She paused. "Poor Lise, she has a good heart. That was the night at the bal Tamborin. That night Lucien opened his arms, and I flung myself into them." She spoke with perfect artlessness, ignorant of a world other than her own, innocent of a moral code other than that which she followed. Once again, as on the day she had first visited the appartement and made acquaintance with the old painter and his wife, dread of some mysterious force filled Maxine. What marvellous power was this that could smile secure at poverty and oblivion, that could cast a halo of true emotion over a bal Tamborin? "It is not true," she cried out in answer to herself. "Not true, madame? Why did I choose Lucien, who is nothing to look upon, who is an artist and penniless?" She ran across to Maxine. She caught her by the shoulders. "Oh, madame, how beautiful you are, and how blind! You bandage your eyes, and you tighten the knot. Oh, my God, if I could but open it for you!" and reduce me to kisses and folly and tears? One made the lift into heaven on a kiss. Jacqueline's voice was like some precious metal, molten and warm. Or one may slip into hell. Do you think I have not known what it is to kiss? It was from a kiss I fled tonight. Her tone was fervent as it was reckless, and Jacqueline stood aghast. The entire denial of love was comprehensible to her, if inexplicable. But her mind refused this problem of realization and rejection. "Madame," she began quickly, but she paused on the word, listening. The sound of Max's door opening and closing came distinctly to the ear, followed by a footstep descending the stairs. "Monsieur Edouard," she whispered, finger on lip. Maxine also had heard, and a look of relief broke the tension of her expression. "He's gone. That is well." Something in her look, in her voice, startled Jacqueline anew. "Why do you speak like that, madame? Why do you look so cold?" "I am sane again, Jacqueline." "And Monsieur Edouard, is he sane, I wonder? Is he cold? Oh, madame, he loves you." "I am going to prove his love. But, madame, oh, madame, love isn't a matter of proving. It is an affair of giving with all the heart." "Trust me, Jacqueline, I understand. Good night." Jacqueline framed no word, but her eyes spoke many things. "Say good night, Jacqueline. Forget that you have entertained a mad woman." "Good night, madame." But the little Jacqueline, left alone, shook her head many times, leaving her heap of blue muslin neglected upon the floor. "Poor child," she said softly to herself. "Poor child. Poor child." End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 34. It was midway between the hours of 9 and 10 on the morning following. Max was standing in the studio. The easel, still bearing the portrait, had been pushed into a corner, its face to the wall. Everywhere the warm sun fell upon a rigid severity of aspect, as though the room had instinctively been bared for the enacting of some scene. Max himself, in a subtle manner, struck the same note. The old painting blouse he usually wore had been discarded for the blue serge suit, severely masculine in aspect. His hair had been reduced to unusual order. His whole appearance was rigid, active, braced for the coming moment. And this moment arrived sooner even than anticipation had suggested. The clocks of Paris had barely clashed the half-hour, when his strained ears caught a step upon the landing, a sharp knock upon the door, and before his brain could leap to fear or joy, Blake was in the appartement, in the room. There was no mistaking Blake's attitude as he swung into the boy's presence. It was patent in every movement, every glance, even had his white, strained face not testified to it. Coming into the studio, he affected nothing, neither apology, greeting, nor explanation. Without preamble, he came straight to the matter that possessed his mind. "You know of this?" He held out a square white envelope bearing bold feminine handwriting, writing over which time and thought and labour had been expended in this same room 10 hours earlier. "You know this?" "Yes." Max's tongue clicked dryly against the roof of his mouth, but his eyes bore the fire of Blake's scrutiny. "You know the contents?" "Yes." "Yes, and you can stand there like a graven image? Do you realize it at all? Do you grasp it?" "I think I understand." "You think you understand?" Blake laughed in a manner that was not agreeable. "Understand, forsooth? You who have never seen anything human or divine that you rate above your own little finger? Understand?" He laughed again. Then suddenly his attitude changed. "But I haven't come here to waste words. You know that your sister has left Paris?" Max nodded, finding no words. "She tells me here that she has gone out of my life, that I am to forget her." "Well?" "Well, that has only one meaning when it comes from the one woman. I must know where she is." Max set his lips and studiously averted his face. "Come, tell me where she is. Time counts." "I do not know." I expected that. You're lying, of course, but when you're up against a man in my frame of mind, lies are poor ammunition. I don't ask you why she is gone. That's between her and me. That's my affair. But I must know where she is. I cannot tell you. You cannot refuse to tell me. Look here, boy, you've always seen my soft side. You don't believe there is a hard one. But we Irish can surprise you. Max had no physical fear, but he backed involuntarily before the menace in Blake's eyes. I'm not lying to you, Ned. I cannot tell you, because I do not know. My sister Maxine has ceased to exist, for me as much as for you. Stop. Blake stepped close to him, and for an instant his hand was raised, but it fell at once to his side, and he laughed once more, harshly and self-consciously. Don't play with me, boy. I've had a hard knock. I'm not playing. It's true. It's true. Dark eyes with dark lines beneath them stared at Blake, carrying conviction. It's true. It's true. I do not know. God, boy! Blake faltered in his vehemence. It's true, said Max again. True that she's gone, vanished, that I can't find her, that you can't find her? It isn't. It is. The blood rushed into Blake's face. For a moment he stood rigid and speechless, drinking in the fact. Then his feelings broke bounds. It's true, and you stand there gaping? God, boy, rouse yourself. He caught him by the shoulder and shook him. Don't you know what this is? Have you never seen a man dealt a mortal blow? Love is not everything, cried Max. Not everything? Oh, you poor damned little fool, how bitterly you'll retract that prating. Not everything? Isn't water everything in a parched desert? Isn't the sun everything to a frozen world? He stopped, suddenly loosing the boy, casting him from him, a thing of no significance. Max, faint and pale, caught at his arm. Ned, I am here. I am your friend. I love you. Blake, in all his whirl of passion, paused. You, he said, and no long eloquence could have accentuated the blank amazement, the searing irony of the word. But Max closed all his senses. Ned, look at the truth of life. There is in me everything but one thing. Then by God that one thing is everything. It's the woman and the man that rule this world. The woman and the man, the soul and the body. All other things are dust and chaff. You feel that now, but time balances. We will be happy yet. We will relive the old days. Blake turned, wrenching away his arm. The old days? Do you imagine Paris can hold me now she is gone? Ned, do you imagine I can live in this town, climb these steps, stand on that balcony that breathes of her? Max was leaning back against the window frame. His brain seemed empty of blood. His heart seemed to pulse in a strange, unfamiliar fashion, while somewhere within his consciousness a tiny voice commanded him urgently to preserve his strength, not to betray himself. You will go away? He heard himself say. Where will you go? To Ireland? To Ireland or hell. Blake walked to the door. Then you are leaving me? You shall know where I am. And if I should need you? Blake made no answer. He did not even look back. If she should need you? He turned. I will come to her at any moment, from anywhere. The door closed. He was gone, and Max stood leaning against the window. His blood still circulated oddly, and now the inner voice with its reiterated commands was rising until it became the thunder of a sea that filled his ears, annihilating all other sounds. A swift, sharp terror smote him. He sought desperately to maintain his consciousness, but, breaking across the effort, an icy breath crept up from nowhere, fanning his cheek, suspending all struggle, and a palpable darkness, like the darkness of brooding wings, closed in upon him, bringing oblivion. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 35. Who shall depict the soul of woman? as well as say to number the silk hairs on the moth's wing, or paint truly the hues in the blown bubble. The soul of woman dwells apart, subject to no laws, trammelled by no precedent, mysterious in its essence, strong in its very frailty. It passes through many phases to its ultimate end, working, as all great agents work, silently and in the dark. With the passing of Blake, the spiritual Maxine entered upon a new phase, was arbitrarily forced into a new phase of existence. The passing of Blake was sudden, tremendous, devastating in its effect, leaving as consequences a moral blackness, a moral chaos. It was a new Maxine who wakened to the realization of facts. Rather, it was a new Max, for it was the masculine, not the feminine ego that turned a set face to circumstance in the moment of desertion, that sedulously wrapped itself in the garment of pride spun and fashioned in happier hours. Now is the test, now is the time, Max insisted, drowning by insistence the poignant cry of the heart, and to this watchword he marched against fate. With set purpose he faced life and its vexed questions in that bitter, precipitate moment. Again it was the beginning of things, but it was the Rue Muller and not the Gare du Nord that was the scene of action. The May sun fell burning on the Parisian pavements, while the blood of the adventurer ran slow and cold. The illusions bred of the winter dawn had been dispersed by the light of day. Life was no glad enterprise, no climbing of golden heights, but the barren crossing of a trackless region where no hand proffered at guidance and false signs misled the weary eyes. One weapon alone was necessary in the pursuance of the grey journey, a sure command, a sure possession of oneself. This thought alone made harmony with the music of the past, and toward its thin sound his ears were strained. Comradeship had come and gone. Love had come and gone. The fundamental idea that had lured him to Paris alone remained, stark, colourless, but recognizable. One must possess one's self. And to achieve this supreme good, one must close the senses and seal up the heart, and be as a creature already dead. To this profound end, Max locked himself in his studio and sat alone while the May morning waxed. To this profound end, moving as in a dream, he at last rose at midday and left the appartement in quest of his customary meal. What that meal was to consist of, whether stones or bread, did not touch his brain, for his mind was solely exercised with wonder at the fact that his will could command the search for food, could compel his dry lips to the savourless duty of eating. As he left the little café, paying his score, he half expected to see his wonder reflected on the good face of Madame the proprietress, and was curiously shocked to receive the usual cheerful smile, the usual cheerful good day, that took no heed of his heavy plight. It was that cheerful superficiality of Paris that can so delightfully mirror one's mood when the heart is light, that can ring so sadly hollow when the soul is sick. It cut Max with a bitter sharpness, and like a man fleeing from his own shadow, he fled the shop. Outside, in the dazzling glitter of the streets, the sun blinded him, accentuating the scorching pain of unshed tears. The very pavements seemed to rise up and sear him with their memories. Here, in this very street, Blake and he had strolled and smoked on many a night, wending homeward from the play or the opera, laughing, jesting, arguing as they paced arm in arm up and down before the sleeping shops. The thought stung him with an amazing sharpness, and he fled from it, as he had fled from the café and its smiling proprietress. His descent upon Paris was a descent upon a region of beauty. The scents of summer lay like a bloom upon the flowers for sale at the street corners, and shimmered, a ribbon of silver sunlight, across the pale blue sky. The trees and the grand boulevards shone in their green trappings, rainbow colours glinted in the shop windows. Everywhere, save in the heart of Max, was fairness and youth and joy. Supremely conscious of himself, adrift and wretched, he passed through the crowds of people, passed from sun to shade, from shade to sun, with a hopeless eager haste that possessed no objects save to outstrip his thoughts. It is a curious fact that, to the desponding, Water has a magnetic call. Without knowledge, almost without volition, his footsteps turned towards the river. That river which has so closely girdled Paris through all her varied life. Smooth and pale, it slipped secretly past its quays as Max approached, indifferent to the tragedies it concealed, as it was indifferent to the ardent life that ebbed and flowed across its many bridges. On his breast the small dark craft of the city nestled lazily. To right and left along its banks the sun struck glints of gold and bronze from spire and monument, while, close against its sides, on the very parapet of its quays, there was in progress that quaint book traffic that strikes so intimate a note in the life of the quarter. It is a charming thought that in the heart of Paris, the pleasure city, there is time and place for the vendor of old books to set out his wares, to lay them open to the kindly sky, to tempt the studious and idle alike to pause and daily lose themselves in that most fascinating of all pursuits, the search for the treasure that is never found. Max paused beside this row of tattered bookstores, and quivered to the stab of a new pain. Scores of happy mornings he had wandered with Blake in this vicarious garden of delight, flitting from the books to the curio shops across the roadway, from the curios back again to the books, while Blake talked with his easy friendliness to the odd beings who bartered in this open market. It was pain inexpressible. It was loneliness made palpable. To stand by the trestle stalls and allow his eyes to rest upon the familiar merchandise. And for the third time in that black morning he fled from his own shadow, fled onward into the darker, older Paris, the Paris of tradition, where the church of Notre Dame frowns, silently scornful of those who disturb its peace. As he approached the great building, its sombre impressiveness fell upon his troubled spirit mercifully, as its shadow fell across the blinding sunlight. He paused in the wide space that fronts the heavy doors, and caught his breath as a fugitive of old might have caught breath at sight of sanctuary. Here was a place of shade and magnitude, a place untouched by memory. Blindly he moved toward the door, entered the church, walked up the aisle. Few sightseers disturbed the sense of peace, for outside it was high noon and Paris was engrossed in the serious business of déjeuner. No service was in progress. All was still, all dim, save where a taper of a lamp glowed before a shrine, or the sun struck sharp through the splendour of stained glass. There are few churches, to some minds that there is no other church, where the idea of the profound broods as it does in Notre Dame. The sense of dignity, the curious ancient scent compounded by time, the mystic colours of the great windows breathe of the infinite. Max, walking up the aisle, looked at the dark walls. Max, modern, critical, looked up at the wondrous rose window, and felt the overshadowing power of superhuman things. The modern world crumbled before the impassive silence. Criticism found no challenge in its brooding spirit, for the mind cannot analyse what it cannot measure. Max subscribed to no creed, but by a strange impulsion, born of dead ages, his eyes fell from the glowing window and turned to the high altar. He did not want to pray. He rebelled against the idea of supplication, but the circling thoughts within him concentrated suddenly. He clasped his hands with a clasp so fierce that it was pain. "Oh God," he said under his breath, "God, God, let me possess myself." And as if some cord had snapped, relieving the tension in his brain, he dropped upon his knees, as he had once done at the foot of his own staircase, and, crouching against a pillar, wept like a lost child. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 36. The last days of August in Paris. A deadly oppression of heat, a brooding inertia that lay upon the city like a cloak. In the little appartement every window stood gaping, thirsting for a draught of air. But no stir lightened the haze that weighed upon the atmosphere. No faintest hint of breeze ruffled the plantation shrubs, dark in their fullness of summer foliage. Stillness lay upon Montmartre, upon the Rue Muller, most heavily of all upon the home of Max. It was an obvious, weighty stillness, unconnected with repose. It seemed as though the spirit of the place were fled, and that in its stead the vacant quiet of death reigned. In the salon, the empty hearth hurt the observer with its poignant suggestion of past comradeship, dead fires, long hours when the spring gales had whistled through the plantations, and stories had been told, and dreams woven to the spurt of blue and copper flames. The place had an aspect of desertion. No book lay thrown face downward upon chair or table. No flowers glowed against the white walls, though flowers were to be had for the asking in a land that teemed with a summer fruitfulness. This was the salon, but in the studio the note of loss was still more sharply struck. Not because the easel, drawn into the full light, offered to the gaze a crude, unfinished study, nor yet because a laden palette was cast upon the floor to consort with tubes and brushes, but because the presiding genius of the place, Max the debonair, Max the adventurous, was seated on a chair before his canvas, a prey to black despair. Max was thinner. The great heat of August, or some more potent cause, had smoothed the curves from his youthful face, drawn the curled lips into an unfamiliar hardness, and painted purple shadows beneath the eyes. Max had fought a long fight in the 3 months that had dwindled since the morning of Blake's going, and a long moral fight has full as many scars to leave behind as a battle of physical issues. The saddest human experience is to view alone the scenes one has viewed through other eyes, to walk solitary where one has walked in company, to have its particular barbed shaft aimed at one from every stick and stone that mark familiar ways. All this Max had known, wrapping himself in his pride, keeping long silence, fighting his absurd, brave fight. The first days will be the worst, he had assured himself, walking back from Notre Dame in the searching sun, heedless of who might notice his red eyes. The first days will be the worst. And this formula he had repeated in the morning, standing uninspired and wretched before a blank canvas. Then had come Blake's first message, a note written from Sweden, without care or comfort, importing nothing, indicating nothing beyond the place at which the writer might be found. And tears, torrents of tears, had testified to the fierce anticipation, the crushing disappointment for which it was responsible. He had sent no answer to the cold communication. No answer had been desired, and calling himself by every name contempt could coin, he pushed forward along the lonely road, companioned by his work. But he himself had once said, "One must come naked and whole to art as one must come naked and whole to nature." And he had spoken a truth. Art is no anodyne for a soul wounded in other fields, and art closed arms to him when most he wooed her. He threw himself into work with pitiable vehemence in those first black weeks. By day he haunted the galleries and attended classes like any art student. By night he ranged the streets and cafes, seeking inspiration, returning to his lonely room to lie wakeful, fighting his ghosts, or else to sob himself to sleep. His theory of life had been amply proved. Blake had prated of the soul, but it had been the body he had desired. Again and again that thought had struck home, a savage spur goading him in daytime to a wild plying of his brushes, gripping him in the lonely darkness of the night-time, until his sobs were suspended by their very poignancy, and the scalding tears dried before they could fall. He saw darkly, he saw untruly, but the world is according to the beholder's vision, and in those sultry days when summer waxed and Paris emptied, opening its gates to the foreigner, all the colours had receded from existence, and he had tasted the lees of life. And now, today, it seemed that the climax had been reached. Seated idly before his canvas, the whole procession of his Paris life unwound before him, from the first tumultuous hour, when he had entered the Hotel Royal on fire for freedom, to this moment, when with dull, resentful eyes he confronted the sum of his labours, an unfinished, sorry study, devoid of inspiration. He stared at the flat canvas, the rough outline of his picture, the reckless splashing on of colour. And abruptly, as if a hand had touched him, he sprang to his feet, making havoc among the paint tubes that strewed the floor, and turned summarily to the open window. It was after 8 o'clock, but the hazy, unreal daylight of a summer evening made all things visible. He scanned the plantation, viewing it as if in some travesty of mourning. He looked down upon the city, sleeping uneasily in preparation for the inevitable night of pleasure, and a sudden loathing of Paris shook him. It seemed as if some gauzy, elusive garment had been lifted from a fair body, and that his eyes, made free of the white limbs, had discerned a corpse. By a natural flight of ideas, the loathing of the city turned to loathing of himself, to an unsatiable desire for self-forgetfulness, for self-effacement. Solitude was no longer tenable. The walls of the appartement seemed to close in about him, stifling, suffocating him. With a feverish movement he turned from the window, picked up his hat, and fled the room. On the landing he paused for a moment before the door of M. Cartel. He had paid many visits to M. Cartel under stress of circumstances similar to this, and invariably M. Cartel, and moving in his shadow the demure Jacqueline, had proffered a generous hospitality, talking to him of work, of politics, of Paris, but with a Frenchman's inimitable tact. For all this unobtrusive attention he had been silently grateful. But tonight he stood by the door hesitating. For long he hesitated, honestly fighting with his mood. But at last the desperation of the mood prevailed. Who could talk of work when work was as an evil smell in the nostrils? Who could talk of politics when the overthrow of nations would not stimulate the mind? He turned on his heel with a little exclamation, hopeless as it was cynical, and ran down the stairs with the gait of one whose destination concerns neither the world nor himself. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 37. Max swung down the Escalier de Saint-Marie in as reckless a mood as ever possessed being of either sex. Nothing of the sweet Maxine was discernible in face or carriage. The boy predominated, but a boy possessed of a callousness that was pathetic, seen hand in hand with youth. For the first time he was viewing Paris bereft of the glamour of romance. For the first time the mask of folly passed before him, licentious and unashamed. Many an hour in days gone by he had discussed with Blake this lighter side of many-sided Paris, and with Blake's wise and penetrating gaze he had seen it in true perspective. But tonight there was no sane interpreter to temper vision. Tonight he was bitterly alone, and his mind, from long austerity, long concentration upon work, had swung with grievous suddenness to the opposing pole of thought. He had no purpose in his descent from the Rue Moulin. He had no desire of vice as an antidote to pain, but his loathing of Paris was drawing him to her with that morbid craving to hurt and re-hurt his bruised soul that assails the artist in times of misery. The streets were quiet, for it was scarcely 9 o'clock, and as yet the lethargy of the day lay heavy on the air. The heat and the accompanying laxity breathed an atmosphere of its own. Every window of every house gaped, and behind the casements one caught visions of men and women negligent of attire and heedless of observation. Romance was dead. Of that supreme fact Max was very sure. A hard smile touched his lips, and hugging his cynicism, he went forward, crossing the boulevard de Clichy, plunging downward into the darker regions of the Rue des Martres and the Rue Montmartre, where the lights of the boulevard are left behind, and the sightseer is apt to look askance at the crude facts that the street lamps divulge to his curious eyes. To the boy, these corners had no terrors, for in his untarnished friendship with Blake, all sides of life had been viewed in turn, as all topics had been discussed as component parts of a fascinatingly interesting world. Tonight he went forward, mingling with the inhabitants of the district, revelling with morbid realism in the forbidding dinginess of their appearance. He was not of that quarter. That was patent to every rough who lounged outside a café door, as it was patent to every slovenly woman who gave him a glance in passing. He was not of the quarter, but he was an artist, and a shabby one at that, so the men accorded him an indifferent shrug, and the women a second glance. Forward he went, possessed by his morbidity, forward into the growing murkiness of environment, until, association of ideas suddenly curbing impulse, he stopped before the door of a shabby café bearing the fanciful appellation of the Café des Cerises Jumelles. Once, when bound upon a night exploration in this same region, he and Blake had stopped to smile at this odd name and wonder at its origin, and finally they had passed through the portal to find that the twin cherries smiled upon doubtful patrons. The vivid memory of that night smote him now, as, drawn by some unquestioned influence, he again entered the café, passing through a species of bar to a long, low-ceilinged eating room set with small tables. How Blake had talked that night! How thoughtfully, how humanely and tolerantly he had judged their fellow guests as they sat at one of these tables rubbing shoulders with the worst, or, as he had laughingly insisted, the best, of an odd fraternity. The recollection was keen as a knife when Max entered the eating-room, sat down, and ordered a drink with the supreme indifference of disillusion. 6 months ago he would have trembled to find himself alone in such a place. Tonight he was beyond such a commonplace as fear. He smiled again cynically, emptied his glass, and looked about him. His first experience of the place had been in the hours succeeding midnight, when the quarter hummed with its unsavoury life. But now it was early, the lights were not yet at their fullest, the waiters as yet had not taken on their nocturnal air of briskness. In one corner 3 men were engrossed in a game of cards. In another a thin girl of 15 sat with her arm round the neck of a boy scarce older than herself, whispering jests into his ear, at which they both laughed in coarse, low murmurs. While in the middle of the room, with her back turned to him, a woman in a tight black dress and feathered hat was eating a meal of poached eggs. In a vague way, absorbed in his own thoughts, Max fell to studying this solitary woman, until something in her impassivity, something in the sphinx-like calm with which she went through the business of her meal, blent with his imagining, and he suddenly found her placed beside Blake in the possession of his thoughts, an integral part of their joint lives. In a flash of memory, the large black hat, the opulent figure, took place within his consciousness, and, answering to a new instinct, he rose and took an involuntary step in the woman's direction. She changed her position at sound of his approach. Her large hat described new angles, and she looked back over her shoulder. "What?" she said aloud. "The little friend of Blake? But how droll!" She showed no surprise. She merely waved her hand to a chair facing her own. Max sat down. A hot and dirty waiter came forward languidly, and wine was ordered. Lisa pushed aside the glass of green-tinted liquid that she had been consuming through a straw, and waited for what was to come. Max, looking at her in the crude light of a gas-jet, saw that her face was whiter, her eyes more hollow than when her wrath had fallen on him at the Bal Tabarin. Also, he noted that a little dew of heat showed through the mask of powder on her face. Silence was maintained until the wine was brought. Then she drank thirstily, laid down her empty glass, and turned her eyes upon him. "You have parted with your friend, eh?" The surprise of the question was so sharp that it killed speculation. He did not ask how she had probed his secret, whether by mere intuition or through some feminine confidence of Jacqueline's. The fact of her knowledge swept him beyond the region of lucid thought. He accepted the situation as it was offered. "Yes," he said, "I have parted with my friend." "And why? He is a good boy, Blake." She looked at him with her inscrutable eyes, and after many days he was conscious of the touch of human compassion. He did not analyze the woman's feelings. He did not even conjecture whether she knew him for boy or girl. All he comprehended was that out of this sordid atmosphere, out of the lethargy of the sultry night, some force had touched him, some force was drawing him back into the circle of human things. Strange indeed are the workings of the mind. He who had shrunk with an agonized sensitiveness from the sympathy of Monsieur Cartel, from the tender comprehension of the little Jacqueline, suddenly felt his reserve melt and break in presence of this woman of the boulevard with her air of impassive ennui. Theoretically, he knew life in all its harder aspects, and it called for no vivid imagination to trace the descent of the fresh grisette of the Côtier Latin to the creature who sought her meals in the Café des Cerises Jumelles, and yet hers was the accepted compassion. "Madame," he said suddenly, "Madame, tell me, you knew me once?" Lisa wiped the dew of heat from her forehead, emptied a second glass of wine. "1,000 years ago, mon petit, when the world was as young as you." "In the Côtier?" "In the Côtier, on the Boule Miche, at Boulier." She stopped, falling into a dream. Then suddenly from the farthest corner of the room came the sound of a loud kiss, and the boy and girl at the distant table began to sing in unison, a ribald song, but instinct with the zest of life. Lisa started as though she had been struck. "There have it, youth!" she cried, with a jerk of her head towards the distant corner. "The world is for them." Then her voice and her expression altered. She leaned across the table until her face was close to Max. "What a little fool you are," she said. "It is written in those eyes of yours that see too little and see too much. Go home. Think of what I have said. He is a good boy, this Blake." Max mechanically replenished her glass, and mechanically she drank. Then she produced a little mirror and made good the ravages of the heat upon her face with the nonchalance of her kind. Finally she looked at the clock. "Come," she said, "we go the same way." He rose obediently. He made no question as to her destination. He had come to drown himself in the sordidness of Paris. And behold, his heart was beating with a human quickness it had not known since the moment he held Blake's first letter unopened in his hand. His throat was dry. His eyes were smarting with the old, half-forgotten smart of unshed tears. He followed her with a strange docility as she passed out of the unsavoury Cerises Jumelles into the close, ill-smelling street. In complete silence they walked through what seemed a nightmare world of unpleasant sights, unpleasant sounds, until across his dazed thoughts the familiar sense of Paris, the sense of the pleasure chase, swept from the Boulevard de Clichy. Lisa paused. He saw her fully in the brave illumination, the large black hat, the close-clad figure, the pallid face. And as he looked, she smiled unexpectedly, and, putting out her hand, patted him on the shoulder. "Goodbye, mon enfant. Go home. Youth comes but once, and this Blake, he is a good boy." Before he could answer, before he could return smile or touch, she was gone, absorbed into the maze of lights, and he was alone, to turn which way he would. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. The 5th floor was dim and silent. The door of Monsieur Cartel's appartement was closed. But Max, mounting the stairs 2 steps at a time, was not daunted by silence or lack of light. Max was once again a prey to impulse, and under the familiar tyranny his blood burned, raced in his veins, sang in his ears. Without an instant's pause he knocked on Monsieur Cartel's door, and when his knock was answered by Jacqueline, fair and cool-looking even in the great heat, words rushed from him as they had been wont to rush when life was a gay affair. "You are alone, Jacqueline?" Jacqueline nodded quickly, comprehending a crisis. "Ah, I thank God!" He caught both her hands. He gave a little laugh that ended in a sob. He passed into the apartment, drawing her with him. "Oh la la!" she cried, hiding her emotion in flippancy. "You take my breath away." Max laughed again. "You see I've lost my own." She gave a scornful, familiar toss of the head. "Do not be foolish. What has happened?" "I've made a discovery, Jacqueline. Youth comes but once." "Indeed? You need not have left the Rue Muller to learn that." "It comes but once, and while it is with me I am going to look it in the face." His words tumbled forth pell-mell, and as he spoke he pulled her forcibly into the living-room. "Jacqueline, I am serious. I have been down in hell. I must see heaven, or my faith is lost." Jacqueline stood very still, making no effort to loose the hot clasp of his hands, but all at once her gaze concentrated piercingly. "You have sent for him!" she exclaimed. "I have. Oh, I may be weak, but listen. In the old days when the world was religious and people observed Lent, there was always Mikarim, was there not? Well, I have fasted, and now I must feast." They gazed at each other, the one aglow with anticipation, the other with curiosity. "You have sent for him at last?" "I have sent a telegram with these words: 'Meet me at midday on Tuesday in the Place de la Concorde. Maxine.'" "And this is Friday," said Jacqueline. "In 4 days' time you will see him again." "Again." Max spoke the word inaudibly. "And when you meet?" Jacqueline's blue eyes were sharp as needle-points. Max coloured to the temples. "Ma chérie, I have not even thought. All I know is that youth comes but once, and that youth is courage. I have been a coward. I am going to be brave." "You are going to confess?" Max said nothing, but with her woman's instinct for such things Jacqueline read assent in the silence. "Then the end is assured. He will take you, with your will or without. Monsieur Max or the Princess?" Max shook his head. "I do not think so. But that is outside the moment. That is the afterward. First there must be midday and the Place de la Concorde. First there must be Mikarim, my hour." "Ah," whispered the little Jacqueline, "your hour." And who shall say what memories glinted through her quick brain, what conjurings of the first waltz with Monsieur Cartel at the Moulin de la Galette, and the last waltz at the Bal Tabarin, when she stepped through the tawdry doorway into her paradise. "Your hour. And where will it be spent, madame?" "Ah." Max's eyes sought heaven, or in lieu of heaven, Monsieur Cartel's ceiling. Max's hand freed Jacqueline's and flew out in ecstatic gesture. "Ah, that is for the gods to say, chérie, and the gods know best." End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 39. Rapture gilded the world. Rapture trembled on the air like the vibrations of a chord struck from some celestial harp. Coming as a divine gift, the first autumnal frost had lighted upon Paris. During the night, fainting August had died, and with the dawn, golden September had been born to the city. Blake, waiting at the foot of the Cour la Reine, consumed with anticipation, drank in the freshness of the morning as though it were a draught of wine. Maxine, crossing the Place de la Concorde, lifted her face to the sky, striving to quiet her pulses, to cool her hot cheeks in the wash of gentle air. Her hour had arrived. None could hinder its approach, as none could mar its beauty. She scarcely recognized the earth upon which she trod. The fierce excitements, the melting tenderness of her moods, warred until emotion ran riot, and the sifting of her feelings became a task impossible. She passed the spot where, 8 months earlier, Max had saluted the flag of France. Her heart leaped. Her glance, flying before her, discovered Blake waiting at his appointed place, and all her wild sensations were suspended. The violently beating heart seemed to stop. The blood moved with a sick slowness in her veins. It seemed impossible that she should go forward, and yet, by the curious mechanism of the human machine, her feet carried her on, until Blake's presence was tangible to all her senses, until suspense was engulfed in actuality, and joy was singing about her in the air, a song so triumphant, so penetrating, that it drowned all whispering of doubt, all murmurs of tomorrow or of yesterday. Tears welled into her eyes. Her hands went out to him. Standing in the full light, she was a tall, slight girl, fastidiously, if simply, dressed, veiled, gloved, shod as befitted a woman of the world. And as he gazed on her, one thought possessed Blake. She who typified all beauty, whose presence was a fragrance, had called to him, chosen him. All the romance stored up through generations welled within him. He would have died for her at that moment as enthusiastically as his ancestors had died for their faith. Catching her hands, he kissed them without a thought for passing glances. "Princess!" The sound of his voice went through her. She laughed to break the sob that caught her throat. She looked up, unashamed of the tears trembling on her lashes. "Monsieur Ned." "Oh, why the monsieur?" "Why the princess?" They both smiled. "Maxine." "Mon ami, mon cher ami." It thrilled her to the heart to say the words. She glanced at him half fearfully, then broke forth afresh, lest he should have time to think. "Ned, tell me, it is true all this? I am not asleep, it is not a dream?" He pressed her hand. "Look round you, it is morning." Her lips trembled. She obeyed him, looking slowly from the cool sky to the tree-tops where the heavy leaves were still damp with the night's frost. "Yes, it is morning," she said. "We have all the day." Watching her intently, he did not add, as would the common lover, "We have many days." She seemed to him so beautiful, so naive, that her words must compass perfection. "We have all the day," he echoed. "How shall it be spent?" Then she turned to him, all graciousness, her young face lifted to the light. "Ah, you must decide. I do not wish even to think. The world is so, how do you say, enchanted." He laughed in delight at her charming, pleading smile, her charming, pleading hesitation. He caught her mood with swift intuition. "That's it. The world is enchanted. Away behind us is the dreaming wood. What do you say? Shall we go and seek the sleeping beauty?" She nodded silently. He was so perfectly the Blake of old, the Blake who understood. "Then the first thing is to find the magic coach. We must have nothing so mundane as a carriage drawn by horses. A magic coach that travels by itself." He signalled to a passing automobile. "Drive to the Pré Catalan, and drive slowly," he directed. He handed her to her seat with all the courtliness proper to the occasion, and they were off, wheeling up the long incline toward the Arc de Triomphe. They were silent while the chauffeur made a way through the many vehicles, past the crowds of pedestrians that infest the entrance to the Bois. But as the way grew clearer, as the spell of the trees, of the green vistas and glimpsed water began to weave itself, Maxine turned and laid her hand gently upon Blake's. "Mon cher, how good you are!" He started, thrilling at her touch. "My dearest, good? In coming to me like this?" He caught her hand quickly. "Don't," he said. "Don't. It isn't right, from you to me. You never doubted that I'd come. You knew I'd come." "Yes, I knew." "Then that's all right." He pressed her hand. He smiled. He reassured her by all the subtle, intangible ways known to lovers, and it was borne in upon her that he had altered, had grown mentally in his months of exile, that he was steadier, more certain of life or of himself, than when he had rushed tempestuously out of Max's studio. She pondered the change, without attempting to analyze it. A deep sense of rest possessed her, and she allowed her hand to lie passive in his, until all too soon their cab swept round to the left, sped past a bank of greenery, and drew up, with a creaking of brakes, before the restaurant of the Pré Catalan. Everywhere was light, silence, and, best boon of all, an unexpected solitude. A solitude that invested the white building with a glamour of unreality, and converted the slight-stemmed, moss-grown trees into spellbound sentinels. "Here is the castle," said Blake. "Look, even the waiters doze until we come to wake them." He handed her to the ground, gave his orders to the chauffeur, and as the cab disappeared into some unseen region, they mounted the wide steps. "Monsieur desires déjeuner?" A sleek waiter disengaged himself from his brethren and came persuasively forward. At this early hour everything at the Pré Catalan was soft and soothing. Later in the day things would alter. The service would be swift and unrestful, the swish of motor cars and the hum of voices would break the spell. But at this hour of noon, Paris, for some obscure reason, ignored the fruitful oasis of the Bois, and peace lay upon it like balm. How charming! Oh, but how charming!" The exclamation was won from Maxine as her glance skimmed the palms, the glittering glasses, and the white table linen, and rested upon the spacious windows that convey the fascinating impression that one whole wall of the room has been removed, and that the ranged trees outside with their satiny green stems actually commune with the gourmet as he eats his meal. "It's what you wanted, isn't it?" Blake's pleasure in her pleasure was patent. Every look, every gesture manifested it. "It is wonderful," she said gently. "Good. And now what is the meal to be? Dragon's wings en casserole, or moonbeams surprise?" She laughed, and a flash of mischief stole through the glance she gave him. "What do you say, mon ami, to poulet bonne femme?" She watched for a gleam of remembrance, but he was too engrossed in the present to recall the trivialities of the past. He gave the order without a thought, save to do her will. Delay was inevitable, and while the meal was in preparation they wandered into the open and visited the farm at the rear of the restaurant, conjuring the farm-like traditions of the place after the accepted custom, entering the sweet-smelling, shadowy cowshed, stroking the sleek, soft-breathing cows, amusing themselves over the antics of the monkey chained beside the door. It was all very pleasant. The illusion of Arcadia was charmingly rendered, and they returned, happy and hungry, in search of their meal. That meal, from its first morsel, was raised above common things, for was it not the first time Blake had broken bread with Maxine? And what true lover ever forgets the rare moment when all the joys of intimacy are foreshadowed in the first serving of his lady, with no matter what triviality of meat or bread or water or wine? The points of the affair are so slight and yet so tremendous, for are they not sacramental, a typifying of things unspeakable? No intimate word was spoken, but at such times looks speak, more poignantly still, hearts speak, and their gay voices, as they laughed and laughed again, held notes that the ear of the waiter never caught, and their silences vibrated with meaning. At last the meal was over. They rose and by one consent looked towards the spacious world outside. "Shall we go into the gardens?" Blake put the question. Maxine silently bent her head. Softly and assiduously their sleek waiter bowed them to the door, and they passed down the shallow steps into the slim shadows of the trees, as they might have passed into some paradise fashioned for their special pleasure. It was a place an hour removed from the mundane world. Passing out of the region of the trees, they came upon a shrubbery that enclosed a lawn and flower-beds, and here, by grace of the gods, was a seat where they sat down side by side, and gave their eyes to the beauty that encompassed them. It was an exotic beauty, yet a beauty of intense suggestion. Summer lay lavishly displayed in the shaven lawn, the burdened shrubs, the glory of flowers. But over her redundant loveliness autumn had spun an ethereal garment. No words could paint the subtlety of this sheath. It was neither mist nor shadow. It was a golden transparency spun from nature's loom, the bridal veil of the young season. "How exquisite!" whispered Maxine, as if a breath might break the spell. "Look at those yellow butterflies above the flowers. They are the only moving things." "It is the place of the sleeping beauty, sweet. It is the place of love." Blake took her hands again and kissed them. Then, with a gentle enveloping tenderness, he drew her to him, looking into her face, but not attempting to touch it. "My sweet, I have come back. What are you going to do with me?" She did not answer. She lay quite still within his arms, her half-closed eyes lingering on the garden, on the white roses, the clustering mignonette, the hovering yellow butterflies. "What are you going to do with me?" She lifted her eyes, dewy with the beauty of the world. "Wait," she whispered. "Oh, wait." "I have waited." But a little longer." "But my love, my dear one—" She stirred in his embrace. She turned with a swift passion of entreaty, putting her fingers across his mouth. Ned, I know, but do this great thing for me. Shut your eyes and your ears. Forget yesterday. Think there will be no tomorrow. Hold this one moment. Give me my 1 hour. She pleaded as if for her life, her body vibrating, her eyes beseeching him. And his answer was to press her hand harder against his lips and to kiss it fervently. He gave no sign of the struggle within him, the doubt that encompassed him. Something had been demanded of him, and he gave it loyally. There was no yesterday, there will be no tomorrow, he said, but today is ours. It was the perfect word, spoken perfectly. Maxine's eyes drooped in supreme content. Her lips curled like a pleased child's. "Ah, but God is good," she said, and with a child's supreme sweetness, she lifted her face for his kiss. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. The hour was sped, the day passed. Night with its dark wings covered the eastern sky, and one by one the stars came forth, stars that gleamed like new silver in the light sharpness of the September air. Having closed eyes to the world of the Pré-Catalan, Maxine and Blake had lengthened the coil of their dream as the day waxed. 3 o'clock had seen them driving into the heart of the Bois, and late afternoon had found them wandering under the formal interlaced trees in the gardens of the Petit Trianon. At Versailles they dined, falling a little silent over their meal, for neither could longer hold at bay the sense that events impended, that all paths, however devious, however touched by the enchanter's wand, lead back by an unalterable law to the world of realities. With an unspoken anxiety they clung to the last moment of their meal, and when coffee had been partaken of, Maxine demanded yet another cup, and resting her elbows on the table, took her face between her hands. "Ned, will you not offer me a cigarette?" He was all confusion at seeming remiss. "My dear one, 1,000 pardons. I did not think—" "That I smoked? Are you disappointed?" He smiled. "It is one charm the more, if there is room for one." He handed her a cigarette and lighted a match, his eyes resting upon her as she drew in the first breath of smoke with a quaint seriousness that smote him with the thought of the boy. "Dearest," he said suddenly, "I've been so happy today that I've thought of no one but ourselves, and now all at once—" Her eyes flashed up to his. She divined his thought, and it was as though she put forth all her strength to ward off a physical danger. "Oh, mon cher, and was it not your day, our day? Would you have marred it with other thoughts?" "No, but yet—" "No, no." She put out her hand. She pleaded with eyes and lips and voice. "Look, until this little cigarette is burned out." She held up the glowing tip. "When that is over, our day is over. Then we return to the world, but not until then. Is it, what do you say, a bargain?" Her white teeth flashed. Her glance flashed with the brightness of tears. Her fingers rested for a second upon his. The restaurant was practically empty. A few summer tourists were dining at tables close to the door, but Blake had chosen the farthest, dimmest corner, and there they sat in semi-isolation, living the last moments of their day with an intensity that neither dared to express, and that each was conscious of with every beat of the heart. Maxine laughed as she drew her second puff of smoke, but her laugh had a nervous thinness. Blake filled their liqueur glasses, but his gesture was uneven, and a little of the brandy spilled upon the cloth. "A libation to the gods," he said. "May they smile upon us." He lifted his glass and emptied it. Maxine forced a smile. "The gods know best," she said, but as she raised her glass, her hand also trembled. But Blake ignored her perturbation, as she ignored his. The coming ordeal lay stark across their path, but neither would look upon it, neither would see beyond the tip of Maxine's cigarette, the tiny beacon consuming even as it gave light. A silence fell, a silence of full 5 minutes. Then Blake, yielding once more to the craving for the solace of contact, put his hand over hers. "Dear one, I know nothing of what is coming, but that I am utterly in your hands. But let me say one thing. Today has been heaven, the golden, the seventh heaven." She said nothing. She did not meet his eyes, but her cold fingers clasped his convulsively, and 2 tears fell hot upon their hands. That was all. That was the sum of their expression. No other word was spoken. They sat silent, watching the cigarette burn itself out between Maxine's fingers. She held it to the very last, then dropped it into her finger bowl and rose. "Now, mon cher." In the dim light she looked very tall and slight, and seemed possessed of a curious dignity. All the animation had left her face. Beneath the eyes were shadows, and in the eyes a tragic sadness, the sadness that the soul creates for itself. Blake rose also, and, side by side, very quietly, they left the restaurant. In the street outside, the cab that had assisted in the day's adventures still waited their pleasure. He handed her to her place, and paused, his foot upon the step. "And now, liege lady, where?" She looked at him gravely, and answered without a tremor, "To Max's studio." Surprise, if surprise touched him, showed not at all upon his face. He gave the order quietly and explicitly, and took his place beside her. Down the broad street of Versailles they wheeled, but both were too preoccupied to see the lurking ghosts of a past regime that lie so palpably in the shadows. And presently Blake's hand found hers once more. "You are cold?" She shook her head. Through the cool night they drove, under the jewelled cloak of the sky, rushing forward toward Paris as Max had once rushed in the mysterious North Express. Blake did not speak or move again until the city was close about them. Then, with a gesture that startled her by its unexpectedness, he drew from his hand the signet ring he always wore, a ring familiar to Max as the stones of the Rue Muller, and slipped it over her third finger. "Oh, Ned!" She started as the ring slipped into place, and her voice trembled with fear and superstition. He pressed her hand. "Don't refuse it. The ring is the emblem of the eternal, and all my thoughts for you belong to eternity." No more was said. They skimmed through the familiar ways until Maxine could have cried aloud for grace, and at last they stopped at the corner of the Rue André de Satte. She stood aside as Blake dismissed the cab. She knew that had speech been demanded of her then, she could not have brought forth a word, so parched were her lips, so impotent her tongue. Her ordeal confronted her. No human power could eliminate it now. To her was the disentangling of knotted threads, the sorting of the colours in the scheme of things. She averted her face from Blake as they mounted the Escalier de Saint-Marie, and her hand clung for supports to the iron railing. Familiar to the point of agony was the open doorway, the dark hall of the house in the Rue Muller. Side by side they entered. Side by side, and in complete silence, they made the ascent of the stairs, each step of which was heavy with memories. On the 5th floor, she went forward and opened the door of Max's appartement. Within, all was dark and quiet, and Blake, loyally following her, passed without comment through the tiny hall, on into the little salon where the light from the brilliant sky made visible the pathetically familiar objects, the old copper vessels, the dower chest, the leathern armchair. This leather chair stood like a faithful sentinel close to the open window, and as his eyes rested on it, he was conscious of a pained contraction of the heart, for it stood exactly where it had stood when last he watched the stars and rambled through his dreams and ideals with the boy for listener. The thoughts came quick and sharp, goading him as many a puzzled thought had goaded him in his months of solitude, and, as at first sigh, he turned to Maxine, a question on his lips. But again she checked that question. Stepping through the shadows, she drew him across the room towards the window. Reaching the old chair, she touched his shoulder, gently compelling him to sit down. "Ned," she said, and to her own ears the words sounded infinitely far away. I seem to you very mad, but you have a great patience. Will you be patient a little longer? She had withdrawn behind the chair, laying both her hands upon his shoulders, and as she spoke, her voice shook in an unconquerable nervousness. Her whole body shook. My sweet, he turned quickly and looked up at her. What is all this? Why are you torturing yourself? For God's sake, let us be frank with each other. But she pressed his shoulders convulsively. Wait, it is only a little moment now. I implore you to wait. He sank back, and as in a dream felt her fingers release their hold and heard her move gently back across the room. Then, overwhelmed by the burden of dread that oppressed him, he leaned forward, bowing his face upon his hands. Minutes passed. How few, how many, he made no attempt to reckon. Then again the hushed steps sounded behind him. The sense of a gracious presence made itself felt. Instinctively he attempted to rise, but as before Maxine's hands were laid upon his shoulders, pressing him back into his seat. He saw her hands in the starlight, saw the glint of his own ring. Ned? Dear one. It is dim here in this room, but you know me? Your soul sees me? Her voice was shaking. Her words sobbed like notes upon an instrument strung to breaking pitch. My dear one, my dear one. His voice too was sharp and pained. He strove to turn in his chair, but she restrained him. No, say without looking. You know me? I am Maxine? Of course you are Maxine. Ah! It was a short, swift sound like the sobbing breath of a spent runner. It spoke 1,000 things, and with its vibrations trembling upon her lips, Maxine came round the chair, and Blake, looking up, saw Max. Max of old, Max of the careless clothes, the clipped, wavy locks. It is in moments grotesque or supreme that men show themselves. He sprang to his feet. He stared at the apparition until his eyes grew wide, but all he said was, God, very softly to himself. God. And then again, God. It was Maxine who opened the floodgates of emotion. Maxine who, with wild gesture and broken voice, dressed the situation in words. Now it is over. Now it is finished, the whole foolish play. Now you have your sight, and your liberty to hate me. Hate me. Hate me. I am waiting. God, whispered Blake again, not hearing her, piecing his thoughts together as a waking man tries to piece a dream. God. The reiteration tortured her. She suddenly caught his arm, forcing him into contact with her. Do not speak to yourself, she cried. Speak to me. Say all you think. Hate me. Hate me. Then at last he broke through the confusion of his mind, startling her as such men will always startle women by their innate singleness of thought. Hate you? He said. Why in God's name should I hate you? Because it is right and just. That I should hate you because I have been a fool? I do not see that. But Ned, she cried. Then suddenly, at its sharpest, her voice broke. She threw herself upon her knees beside the chair and sobbed. And then it was that Blake showed himself. Kneeling down beside her, he put both arms about the boyish figure, and, holding it close, poured forth not questions, not reproaches, not protestations, but a stream of compassion. Poor child, poor child, poor child, what a fool I've been, what a brute I've been. But Maxine sobbed passionately, shrinking away from him as though his touch were pain. My child, how foolish I've been. But how foolish you have been too, how sweetly foolish. You gave with one hand and took away with the other. But now it is all over. Now you are going to give with both hands. I am to have my friend and my love as well. It is very wonderful. Oh, sweet, don't fret, see how simple it all is. But Maxine's bitter crying went on, until at last it frightened him. Maxine, don't for God's sake. Why should you cry like this? What is it, when all is said and done, but a point of view? and a point of view is adjusted much more quickly than you think. At first I thought the earth was reeling round me, but now I know that 'twas only my own brain that reeled. And I know too that subconsciously I must always have recognized you in Max, for I never treated Max as a common boy, did I? Did I now? I always had a queer respect for him. Dear one, see it with me. Try to see it with me. His appeal was pathetic. It was he who was the culprit, he who extenuated and pleaded. The position struck Maxine, wounding her like a knife. "Oh, don't," she cried in her own turn. "Don't, for the sake of God." "But why, my sweet, my love, my little friend, Maxine?" It was not to be borne. She wrenched herself free and sprang to her feet, confronting him with a pale face down which the tears streamed. "Because I am not your love, I am not your friend, I am not your Max or your Maxine." Swift as she, he was on his feet, his bearing changed, his manhood recognizing the challenge in her voice, his instinct of possession alive to combat it. "Not mine?" he said. And to Maxine, standing white and frail before him, the words seemed to have all the significance of life itself. Now at last they confronted each other, man and woman. Now at last the issue in the war of sex was to be put to the test. She had always known that this moment would arrive, always known that she would meet it in some such manner as she was meeting it now. "Not mine," Blake said again. She shook her head, throwing back her shoulders, clasping her hands behind her, unconsciously taking on the attitude of defiance. "And why not?" It was curt, this question, as man's vital questions ever are. It was an onslaught that clove to the heart of things. She trembled for an instant, then met his eyes. "Because I will belong to no one. I must possess myself." He stared at her. "But it is not given to anyone to possess himself. How can you separate an atom from the universal mass?" "An atom may detach itself."
"And fall into space. Is that self-possession? But my God, are we going to split hairs? Maxine, Maxine!"
He came close to her and put out his arms, but with a fierce gesture she evaded him, then, as swiftly, caught his hand. Oh, Ned, can't you see?"
"No," said Blake simply. "I cannot."
"Listen, then listen. I know myself for an individual, for a definite entity. I know that here within me," she struck her breast, "I have power to think, power to achieve. And how do you think that power is to be developed?" She paused, looking at him with burning eyes. "Not by the giving of my soul into bondage, not by the submerging of myself in another being. That night in Petersburg I saw my way, the hard way, the lonely way. Oh, Ned." She stopped again, searching his face, but his face was pale and immobile, curiously, unnaturally immobile. With a passionate gesture she flung his hand from her. "Oh, it is so cruel. Can't you see? Can't you understand? I left Russia to make a new life. I made myself a man, not for a whim, but as a symbol. Sex is only an accident, but the world has made man the independent creature. And I desired independence. Sex is only an accident. Mentally I am as good a man as you are."
10 times a better man,"
said Blake startlingly. "But not near so good a woman. For I know the highest thing, and you do not." "The highest thing?"
"Love."
"Ah!" She threw up her hands in despair and walked to the window, looking up blankly at the stars. Then suddenly she spoke again, tossing her words back into the room. "I suppose you think I am happy in all this?" He was silent. "I suppose you think I find this heaven?" At last he answered. He came across to her. He stood looking at her with his strange new expression of inscrutability.
"Oh, Maxine," he said, "why must you misjudge me? Little Maxine who could be taken in my arms this minute and carried away to my castle like a princess of long ago, but who would break her heart over the bondage. I haven't much, dear one, to justify my existence, but the gods have given me intuition. I do not think you are in heaven." He waited a moment.
while in the sky above them the stars looked down impartially upon the white domes of the church and the beacons of pleasure in the city below. "Maxine, shall I say the things for you that you want to say?" She bent her head. "Well, first of all, God help us, the world is a terrible tangle. And then you have a strange soul that has never yet half revealed itself. You sent me away from you because you feared love. You called me back because you feared your fear. No, no, you are reasoning now, not justifying, you are entrapping me." "Am I?" "Yes, and I refuse to be entrapped. I know love, I know all the specious things that love can say. The talk of independence, the talk of equality. But I know the reality too. The reality is the absolute annihilation of the woman, the absolute merging of her identity." "So that is love?" "That is love." He stood looking at her with a long, profound look of deep restraint, of great sadness. "Maxine," he said at last, "you have many gifts, a high intelligence, a young body, a strong soul. But in the matter of love you are a little child. To you love is barter and exchange, but love is not that. Love is nothing but a giving, an exhaustless giving of one's very best." She tried to laugh. "I understand. I should give." "No, sweet, you should not. You cannot know the privileges of love, for you do not know love." "Oh, Ned, how cruel, how cruel!" "You do not know love." He spoke very gently, without any bitterness. "And I do know it, for it has grown in me day by day in these long months away from you. I am not to be praised any more than you are to be blamed. But I do love you, with my heart and my soul, with all my life and my strength. I would die for you, if dying would help you. And as it won't, I will do the harder thing, live for you." Her lips were parted, but they uttered no sound. Her eyes, dark with thought, searched his face. "Oh, Maxine," he caught her hand, "how low you have rated me to think I would wrest you from yourself. Is it my place to make life harder for you?" Still she gazed at him. "I do not understand," she said in a frightened whisper. "Never mind, sweet, it doesn't matter if you never understand. Just give me credit for one saving grace." He spoke lightly, as men speak when they are bankrupt of hope. Then, with a sudden breaking of his stoicism, he caught her in his arms, straining her close, kissing her mouth, talking incoherently to himself. "Oh, Maxine, little fawn of the green groves, if you could know! But what am I that I should possess the kingdom of heaven?" His ecstasy frightened her. She struggled to free herself. "What is it?" she asked. "What is it?" "Just love, no more, no less. Good-bye, take your life, make of it what you will. But know always that one man at least has seen heaven in your eyes." Again he held her to him, his whole life seeming to flow out upon his thoughts and to envelop her. Then his arms relaxed, and very soberly he took first one of her hands, and then the other, kissing each in turn. "Maxine." "Ned?" The word faltered on her lips. "That's right," he whispered. "I only wanted you to say my name. Good-bye now, don't fret for me. After all, everything is as it should be." She stood before him, the conqueror. All preconceptions had been scattered. She had not even won her laurels, they had been placed at her feet. And all the pomp and circumstance she could summon to her triumphing was a white face, a drooping head, and speechless lips. "Good-bye, Maxine." The words cried for response, and by a supreme effort she summoned her voice from some far region. "Good-bye." He did not kiss her hand again, but bending his head, he solemnly kissed his own ring, lying cold upon her finger. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. All was finished. Mystery was at an end. The pilgrim's staff had been placed in Maxine's hand, her feet set towards the great white road. She leaned back against the window of the salon, and her mental eyes scanned that road, the coveted road of freedom, the way of a splendid isolation, and in a vague, dumb fashion she wondered why the whiteness that had gleamed like snow in the distance should take on the hue of dust seen at close quarters. She wondered why she should feel so absolutely numbed, why life with its exuberances of joy and sorrow should suddenly have receded from her as a tide recedes. There had been no battle. Hers was a bloodless victory. Fate had been exquisitely kind, as is fate's way when she would be ironical. Maxine could call up no cause for grief or for resentment, no cause even for remorse. She had confessed herself, she had been shriven and blessed and bade to go her way. Passing in review these phantom speculations, her eyes suddenly refused the vision of the mythical white road, stretching away in brain-sickening length, and her physical sight caught at the familiar picture revealed by the balcony, the thrice-known, thrice-loved shrubbery, where already the glossy holly leaves were stirring under September's fingers, whispering one to the other of fine, cold autumn hours when gales would sweep the heights, bringing death to their frailer brethren, while they themselves nestled snug and strong, laughing at the elements. She traced the familiar outline of these sturdy bushes, and her perfect triumph seemed like a winding sheet about her limbs. She was above the world, removed from care, and all she knew was that she would have given her heart for one moment of the hot human grief that had seared her not 4 months ago. She turned from the trees, turned from the stars, and moved back into the unlighted room. All was quiet and dim. She stumbled against the armchair, and recoiled as though her friend had touched her inopportunely. Then she passed blindly onward, finding the little hall, finding the outer door with groping hands. Outside was a deeper darkness, for here no starlight penetrated. But Monsieur Cartel's door was ajar, and through the opening came a streak of lamplight and the hum of voices. Pausing, Maxine caught the deep, humorous tones of Monsieur Cartel himself, broken first by an unknown voice, quick, tense, typically Parisian, then by the light laugh of Jacqueline. In her cruel perfection of triumph she had no need to fear these voices, these little evidences of sociability. They could not hurt her, for was she not impervious to pain? Another laugh, full and contented, came to her ear, then the opening of the piano, and the masterful striking of a chord. A murmur of pleasure gave evidence of an audience, and instinctively she moved forward, as a wanderer on a dark night draws near to a lighted dwelling. Gaining the door, she softly pushed it open, as Monsieur Cartel executed a roulade, which melted into a brilliant piece of improvisation. A bright lamp shone in the hall, but beyond the open door of the living-room displayed a half-lighted interior, with a handful of people grouped about it. Foremost figure was Monsieur Cartel, seated at his music within a radius of yellow light shed by 4 candles, while, beside him, a tall, thin boy, and behind him Jacqueline seemed enclosed in a secondary, fainter circle of luminance. The rest of the room was in shadow, and as Maxine entered she scarcely noticed the 3 other occupants, 2 men and a woman, who sat in a row close to the door, their backs to the wall. No one commented upon her entry. The little Jacqueline glanced round once, smiling a quick welcome, but returned immediately to her contemplation of Monsieur Cartel. The younger of the 2 men by the door, an Italian, paused in the lighting of a cigarette, but his companion, an old Polish Jew with a classic head and long grey beard, retained his attitude of rapt attention, while the woman, who sat a little apart and whose large black hat hid her face, made no sign. Treading softly, Maxine entered and crept into a seat opposite the trio, realizing, with an indifference that surprised her, that the woman was Lisa of the Bal Tabarin and the Café des Cerises Jumelles. The music poured forth, a glittering stream of sound. The young Italian lighted cigarette after cigarette, smoking furiously and beating soundless time upon the floor with his foot. The old Pole sat lost in an emotional dream, tears gathering slowly in his eyes and trickling unheeded down his cheeks, while Lisa, in her moveless isolation, gazed with fixed intensity at the wall above Maxine's head. Time passed. Time seemed of small account in that atmosphere, as the outside world was of small account. Not one of the little audience questioned how the other lived. It mattered nothing that in other hours the artistic fingers of the young Italian were employed in the manufacture of fraudulent antiques, that the enthusiast by the piano wrote humorous songs at a starvation wage for an unsuccessful comique, that Lisa, finding humanity foolish, made profit of its folly. What would you? They would have asked with a shrug. One must live. For the rest, there were moments such as this, moments when the artist was paramount in each of them, when pure enthusiasm made them children again. Monsieur Cartel played on. He had forsaken improvisation now and was interpreting magnificently. Occasionally the boy by the piano threw up his hands ecstatically, muttering incoherently to himself. Occasionally the young Italian broke silence by a sharp, irresistible brava. But for the most part, respectful silence spoke the intensity of the spell. Then at last Maxine, sitting in her corner, saw Jacqueline bend over the shoulder of Monsieur Cartel, her hair shining like sun rays in the candlelight, saw her whisper in his ear, saw him look up and nod in abrupt acquiescence, and saw his square-tipped fingers lift for an instant from the keys, and descend again to a series of new chords. A little murmur of interest passed over the listeners. The Italian threw away his half-smoked cigarette and lighted another. The Pole smiled tolerantly with half-closed eyes, as the old smiled at the vagaries of the young, and Maxine, in her shadowed seat, felt her heart leap tumultuously as the little Jacqueline, her arm naively round the shoulders of Monsieur Cartel, her head thrown back, began to sing the first lines of the duet in Louise. Depuis le jour où je me suis donné, toute fleurie semble ma destinée. Je crois rêver sous un ciel de furie, l'âme encore grisée de ton premier baiser. And Monsieur Cartel, lifting his head, broke in with the single electric cry of Julian the lover. Louise! Then, as if answering to the personal note, Jacqueline melted into Louise's sweet admission of absolute surrender. Quelle belle vie! Ah, je suis heureuse, trop heureuse, et je tremble délicieusement au souvenir charmant du premier jour d'amour. The effect was instant. The youth by the piano smiled radiantly and nodded in vehement approval. The young Italian puffed fiercely at his cigarette. A flash of light crossed Lisa's gaze, causing it to concentrate. Jacqueline had no extraordinary voice, but music was native to her, and she sang as birds sing, with a true light sweetness exquisite to the ear. Souvenir charmant du premier jour d'amour. The declaration came to the listeners with a pure sincerity. It abounded in simplicity, in youthfulness, in conviction. A quiver ran through Maxine. Her numbed senses vibrated. By an acute intuition, she realized the composer's meaning. More, she appreciated the thrill called up in the soul of Monsieur Cartel. Her ears were strained to catch each note, each phrase, with an intentness that astonished her. It suddenly appeared that out of all the world, one thing alone was of significance, the close following of this song, the apprehending of its purpose. Souvenir charmant du premier jour d'amour. The first night with Blake upon the balcony sprang back to memory, and with it the wonder, the delight, the illimitable sense of kinship with the universe. Again the spiritual sense lived in her, not warring with the physical, but justifying, completing it. She sat upright against the wall, suddenly fearful of this overwhelming mental disturbance, fighting the cloud of memory almost as one fights a bodily faintness. The music grew in meaning. She heard Julian's ardent question, Tu ne regrettes rien? And Louise's triumphant answer, Rien. The words, simply human, divinely just, assailed her ears, and by light of the intuition, the superconsciousness that was dominating her, the whole truth of this confessed love poured in upon her soul. She saw the halo about the head of the little singer. She appreciated the sublime giving of herself that cried in the music of the song. It was no mere sentiment on the lips of this fair child, it was the proclamation of a tremendous fact. She leaned back against the wall, lips set, hands clasped. She clung to the rock of her theories like a drowning man, and like the drowning man she realized the imminence of the inundation that threatened her. The music swelled, and now it was not Jacqueline alone who sang. Monsieur Cartel's voice rose, completing, perfecting the higher feminine notes, blending with them as the music of wind or running water might harmonize with the singing of a bird. It was not art, but nature that was at work in the words. Nous sommes tous les amants, fidèles à leur serment. Ah, le divin roman! Nous sommes tous les âmes que brûle la sainte flamme du désir. Ah, la parole idéale dont s'enivre mon corps tout entier. Dis encore ta chanson de délices, ta chanson victorieuse, ta chanson de printemps. The duet wore on, enthralling in its closeness to common human life, with its touches of tears, its touches of laughter, its hints of tenderness and bursts of passion. Not one face but had softened in comprehension as Louise painted the picture of her home, of the gentle father, the scolding mother, the little daily frictions that wear patience thin. Not one heart but had leaped when passion broke away through the song, mounting as upon wings, until Louise in her ecstasy of love and joy and incredulity exclaimed, "C'est le paradis! C'est une féerie!" And Julian answers, "Non, c'est la vie, l'éternelle, la toute-puissante vie." It was the supreme, the psychological moment. The duet continued, but Maxine heard no further words. They echoed and re-echoed in her brain, they obsessed her, lifting her to a subliminal state. Across the room she saw the Italian throw away his cigarette and forget to replace it. She saw Lisa lean forward breathlessly, and she knew that in fancy she was back in the Quartier Latin, where life was young, when love laughed and her hair was wreathed with vine leaves. She saw her at last as a living woman, felt the grape juice run down her neck, felt the kisses of the Jacques Auger who was 10 years dead. This then was the sum of life, not the holding of fair things, but the giving of them. She rose up. Her limbs shook, but she paid no heed to physical strength or weakness. She was on a plane where the soul moved free, regardless of mortal needs. Neither Max nor Maxine had any place in her conceptions. She saw Lisa, broken but justified, because she had given when life asked of her. She saw the little Jacqueline with a halo of candlelight turning her blonde hair to gold. In a distant dream she saw the frail, steadfast Madame Salah, and in a near, poignant vision she saw Blake, and her soul melted within her. She conceived the world as one immense censer into which men and women poured their all, and from which a wondrous white smoke, scent incredibly lovely, rose continually, enveloping the universe. To give without hope of recompense, without question, without fear. That was the message of life. She looked round the little room. She yearned to put out her arms, to clasp each hand, to touch each forehead with the kiss of living fellowship. Love consumed her, humility rilled her. She was a child again, with all things to learn. The music was reaching its climax. It was filling every corner of the room, and as she glanced towards the piano in a last long look, the two voices rose in unison. Silently, none knowing the revolution within her soul, none seeing the heights upon which she walked, Maxine moved to the door and slipped out into the hall, the picture of the lovers before her eyes. In her ears the symbolic cry, "C'est la vie, l'éternelle, la toute-puissante vie." Like a being inspired, she passed back into her own apartment, and there, with a strange, high excitement that was yet mystically calm, entered her little bedroom and lighted candles until not a shadow was left in all the white, circumscribed space. Then, standing in the illumination like an acolyte who ministers to some secret rite, she slowly unburdened herself of her boy's garments. The task was brief. They fell from her lightly, leaving her fair and virginal and untrammelled in body, as she was virginal and untrammelled in mind. And with a sweet gravity she clothed herself, garment by garment, in the dress of the morning. Ardent and eager, yet restrained as befitted a woman aware of her high place, she left the room and passed down the Escalier de Saint-Marie. A rush of cool air came to her across the plantation, kissing her hot cheeks. The holly bushes whispered their secrets, which were her secrets as well. The eyes of the stars looked down, smiling into her eyes. She observed no face in the thronging faces that passed her. She made her steadfast way to the one point in the universe that was her goal by right divine. Even in the hallway of Blake's house she did not stop to question, but mounted the stairs and knocked upon his door, regardless of the stormy beating of her heart, the faintness of anticipation that encompassed her. A moment passed, a moment or a century. Then he was before her, appealing to the innermost recesses of her being. He stared at her as one might stare upon a ghost. "Maxine." Her lips parted, trembling with a pleading tenderness. "Maxine," he said again, and now his voice shook, as hers had shaken in Max's little starlit studio. It was the cry she had waited for, the confirmation of her faith. Her hands went out to him, her soul suddenly poured forth allegiance in look and voice. "Ned, Ned, take me and teach me, take me away to your castle like the princess of old. Show me the white sky and the opal sea and the seaweed that smells like violets." His hands clasped hers, his incredulous eyes besought her. "Maxine, this is some dream?" "No, it is no dream. We are awake. It is life." End of chapter 41. End of Max by Katherine Cecil THURSTON.